Your damn hut is ruining my view, and I've had enough." Karen's voice was loud, with an edge of accusation. She thrust a stack of papers in my direction. "This is my property," I said, glancing at the documents. "It's within legal boundaries." She retorted, her tone sharp. "This is a tourist destination. I paid for this view, and now it's blocked. You're not just trespassing, you've turned your hut into a billboard." I felt the weight of her words, knowing her influence in the community. Karen had rallied the neighborhood against me, painting my home as a problem. Her allies, wealthy, neighbors, and connections in the legal world were all working against me. "I didn't build this hut to harm your property," I replied, trying to remain calm. "It's a home, not an advertisement." She sneered. "A home? This is a violation of zoning laws. You're in the wrong, and I'll make sure the law sees it the same way." Her words were a direct threat. She wasn't just angry, she was intent on destroying what I had built. Karen acted swiftly. Within a week, I received both a summons to court and an official notice from the city's zoning commission. The legal documents were clear and direct. My Adobe structure was now classified as an illegal billboard because it obstructed a public view. The accusation felt absurd. I wasn't operating a business. I wasn't running an advertisement. I had built the hut as a home. But to Karen, it was simply an obstruction to her luxury. The simple Adobe structure, designed with natural materials, didn't match her idea of what the area should look like. To her, it was an eyesore, and, more dangerously, something she could leverage in her favor. When the court hearing arrived, I was accompanied by my lawyer, Sarah. She was young, but experienced, sharp, and determined to fight. As we sifted through the documents, it was clear this wasn't a typical case. Sarah quickly scanned the zoning report and muttered under her breath, "Billboard, this is a mess. They're pulling some serious strings here, but we're not backing down." The room was already stacked against me. The judge, an older man with a stern face and no apparent interest in the details of the case, seemed impatient. As he reviewed Karen's complaint, his gaze remained fixed on the paperwork in front of him as he spoke. "This is a serious matter," he said in a tone that suggested the outcome was already decided. "Your building has violated local ordinances regarding visibility in public space. You're being accused of using it as an illegal advertisement. You've received multiple warnings. What do you have to say for yourself, Mr. Nair?" I opened my mouth, but for a moment, no words came. It was hard to respond when the entire system seemed to be working against me. Karen's wealth and her connections in the local community made sure that my side of the story was already being overshadowed. "I didn't build this hut to advertise anything," I finally managed to say, my voice firm despite the doubt in my mind. "I built it to live in peace, exactly as the law allows. I'm not selling anything. This is my home." Karen's expression twisted into a smirk, the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. She crossed her arms in front of her, as if she were already dismissing everything I had just said. "His home." "Your Honor," she interjected, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "That's exactly the problem. A man with no taste, using his property to ruin what we all care about. It's not just an eyesore. It's a violation of the community's values." Her words hung in the air, sharp and calculated. Karen's claim was not just about the structure itself. It was a personal attack on who I was and what I represented. To her, my existence in this neighborhood was a disruption, a challenge to the pristine image she and her wealthy neighbors had worked hard to cultivate. The judge, whose disinterest was becoming more apparent, looked at the legal paperwork in front of him again, then glanced at me. He didn't respond to Karen's jab. Instead, he cleared his throat and leaned back in his chair, as if waiting for me to make my case. But how could I argue against accusations that were based on personal prejudice rather than law? "I'm not here to destroy anything," I said, trying to make myself heard despite the mounting pressure. "I'm here because I wanted to live quietly, in a way that respected the land and the traditions of this place. The zoning regulations allow for homes like mine. I'm not breaking any laws." Karen's lawyer, an older man who had been silently reviewing his notes, spoke up at that moment, his voice deliberate and filled with condescension. "Your Honor, let's not forget the public interest here. Mr. Nair's home may be a private residence in his eyes, but the reality is that it is a public nuisance, blocking an important view. It goes against the very principles this neighborhood was built on." The judge nodded, without acknowledging my response. He didn't seem interested in the nuances of my situation. His eyes kept darting to the pile of paperwork, as if he already knew which way the case was going. It was clear that Karen's influence or ties to the community were playing a significant role. Her accusations had been powerful enough to paint me as a threat to the status quo, and the law, in this case, seemed to be a tool she could wield to her advantage. I turned to Sarah, but her expression was unreadable. She hadn't said much during the hearing, and I could tell she was processing everything. The strategy wasn't clear yet, but what was evident was that I was being painted as the antagonist, and no one seemed willing to question that narrative. The judge spoke again, his voice more final this time. The complaint is serious. Mr. Nair, you've been warned. You've received notice from the Zoning Commission. This case will proceed. I nodded, but I could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on me. The wheels of the legal system were turning, and it didn't matter how much sense my defense made. The forces lined up against me were too powerful. The judgment had already been made in the eyes of Karen and those she had rallied behind her. Stakes in the case went beyond the immediate dispute over the structure itself. It wasn't just about zoning laws or property rights. This was a larger power struggle. Karen's complaint had transformed from a simple objection about a blocked view into a concerted attack on my very right to exist in the space I had claimed. The accusation that my Adobe hut was a billboard, something that violated public space, was only the surface. Beneath that, there was a deeply personal conflict rooted in a broader cultural and economic war over the land. Karen was not just an angry neighbor. She had a financial interest in the area, having purchased the land next to mine with plans to develop it into a high-end resort. Her vision for the neighborhood was one of pristine, commercial luxury. My presence there, with my modest home, represented everything she sought to exclude. The hut, crafted from local materials and built with hands-on labor, stood as a stark contrast to the shiny new developments Karen hoped to bring to the region. This wasn't just a legal battle. It was a battle of identities. Karen wanted to reshape the community to fit her vision of wealth and exclusivity, and I had become the symbol of everything she despised. The project she had in mind depended on the removal of any elements that didn't fit her ideal of an upscale, well-managed neighborhood. My hut was more than a home. It was a statement against the very commercial forces she sought to control. The legal claims against me, although framed as a simple violation of zoning laws, were built on the premise that my existence was a disruption to the order Karen and others like her wanted to impose. To them, my modest lifestyle and self-built structure were threats. I had come to understand that Karen's argument wasn't rooted in the inconvenience of a blocked view. It was rooted in her need to eliminate what she considered unrefined from her landscape. Sarah, my lawyer, recognized this underlying dynamic. She leaned in during a break in the hearing and spoke quietly. This is bigger than a zoning issue. Karen has money, influence, and the power to make things difficult. She's using this as a way to break you. The realization hit hard. I had always believed that if I followed the law, if I respected the boundaries set by the city, I would be left alone to live as I saw fit. But now it was clear. I wasn't just fighting Karen's claim of a blocked view. I was fighting an entrenched system that allowed wealth and influence to dominate, that allowed the powerful to dictate who could and could not live in a given space. I didn't ask for this, I muttered. I just wanted to live my life. But the situation had escalated far beyond that. The court case had become a test of whether I had the right to live in my home, or if my home could be torn down simply because it didn't fit the narrative of those with power. If the court sided with Karen, the consequences would be severe. They weren't limited to a forced demolition of my hut. The precedent set by this case could send a message to others in the area. If you weren't willing to conform to a certain standard, you could be swept away. The immediate threat was clear. If Karen succeeded, I would lose the structure I had worked so hard to build. But the stakes were even higher than that. I would be forced to pay for the privilege of living on my own land, likely at an inflated price that no one like me could afford. Karen's aim wasn't just to get rid of the hut. She wanted to eliminate any obstacle to her plans for a luxury resort. If my property were devalued or outright taken, she could expand her vision without a second thought. Moreover, the case set a dangerous precedent. If a community member's home could be legally defined as a billboard, it wouldn't be long before others in the area faced similar attacks. It would create an environment where any structure that didn't fit the conventional mold could be legally challenged. Its owner forced into expensive, drawn-out battles just to keep their home. The community would lose its diversity of living spaces, replaced by uniform, commercially profitable designs. I wasn't just fighting for my hut, I was fighting for the right of anyone who chose to live differently, to have a space of their own, free from the pressure of commercialization. As I sat in the courtroom, listening to Karen's lawyer continue to make his case, I realized the broader implications of this dispute. This wasn't just about one building or one view, it was about the control of land, the imposition of one group's values on the entire community, and the erasure of those who didn't fit into the new vision of prosperity. The judge had already shown a reluctance to challenge the influence of wealthy individuals like Karen. The council members in the room, likely swayed by Karen's connections, appeared uninterested in questioning the narrative she had built. The dynamics in the room were clear. The odds were stacked against me, but I had no choice but to continue. I couldn't let Karen win, not just for me, but for everyone who might face the same fight in the future. The system was rigged, but I had to play the game if I wanted to ensure the future of my land and my right to live on it. The stakes had never been clearer. This wasn't just a legal battle. It was a fight for the very essence of what it meant to live freely. To be allowed to exist on your own terms, without the shadow of wealth and power looming over you. As Karen's lawyer continued to present his case, the images of my Adobe structure flashed on the screen. The photos were taken from various angles, highlighting what they referred to as the unsightly view. They made sure to emphasize every angle that could be considered a disturbance. With each new image, the case against me grew. I felt the weight of the accusations mounting, but there was something about the evidence being presented that didn't sit right with me. It wasn't that the images were misleading. It was that something important was missing. Then, it hit me. A thought that had been lingering in the back of my mind finally clicked into place. I wasn't just being accused of violating local zoning laws based on the visibility of my structure. I was being targeted because my home didn't align with the vision Karen had for the neighborhood. But this wasn't simply a matter of aesthetics. There was something far more significant at play: the legal use of the land. Without warning, I spoke up. "What about the land usage map from the city archives?" I asked, the words coming to me in a rush. Sarah turned to me, confused by the sudden mention. "What do you mean?" "The legal map. The one that outlines where buildings can be constructed and the restrictions that apply. This isn't just about zoning laws for aesthetics. It's about the actual legal use of the land." I felt the certainty in my words now, a sense of clarity cutting through the fog of the case. You can't change zoning regulations arbitrarily, especially not in a way that benefits only one party. Sarah's eyes sharpened as she processed the new angle I was suggesting. She reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and started scrolling through public records. It didn't take long. Before she froze, the map was right there in front of us. My heart skipped a beat. The map showed what I had hoped it would. I pointed to the section that confirmed my suspicion. "Look here," I said, drawing Sarah's attention to the relevant area on the screen. Karen's property was originally zoned for agricultural use. It was never properly rezoned for the luxury development she's trying to build. On the other hand, my land is legally designated for single residential use. It's clear, if anyone is in violation here, it's her, not me. I turned to face Karen's lawyer, who had been sitting smugly as he presented his arguments. His expression faltered, just for a moment. He glanced at Karen, whose eyes widened in disbelief as she saw the map on Sarah's phone. For the first time in this entire process, Karen's demeanor shifted. The carefully constructed narrative that she had been relying on seemed to crack. The lawyer cleared his throat and attempted to regain control of the situation. "This is irrelevant," he said, his voice forced. "We are here to discuss the violation of view regulations, not the zoning of the properties." But Sarah was already standing firm, her voice confident. "I beg to differ. The legal designation of the land is the foundation of this case. You can't argue that the property is violating zoning laws without recognizing that Karen's property was never properly rezoned. The map speaks for itself." She turned back to me and added, "We'll have these documents verified and request an official review. Your client has failed to follow the correct procedures for rezoning. There's no way to ignore that." Karen's lawyer seemed to be scrambling now, trying to come up with a counter-argument, but the evidence was in front of him, and there was no denying it. The map didn't just show the legal layout of the properties. It exposed the flaw in Clancy had been trying to force through a development that didn't comply with the law, and the more we discussed it, the clearer it became. Her focus on my structure was merely a diversion, a tactic to distract from her own legal oversights. The room grew quiet as everyone absorbed the new information. The judge, who had been disinterested in the finer details up until this point, leaned forward, eyeing the map on Sarah's phone. It was clear that this new evidence shifted the dynamics of the case. The question was no longer about whether my hut was an eyesore, it was about whether Karen had followed the proper legal steps for her development. Karen, who had been so confident moments before, now appeared rattled. She had spent so much time framing me as the problem, and in one simple revelation, the focus had turned to her. Sarah didn't give up her ground. "Your Honor," she said, looking directly at the judge, "we've presented evidence showing that Karen's property has not been rezoned according to city regulations. It's her development that's the issue, not my client's residence. If there's a violation here, it's on her side." The judge, who had been silent up until that point, glanced at the map again, his brow furrowing. This was a complication he hadn't anticipated. The case was no longer clear-cut. Karen's lawyer tried to reassert control, but the damage had been done. The legal focus had shifted. The map, and the details Sarah had drawn attention to, had revealed an oversight on Karen's part that could not be ignored. It was no longer just a question of whether my hut was blocking a view, it was a question of whose land had been handled improperly from the start. The tables had turned, and the case was no longer about a single man's humble home. It was about the larger issue of land use, and whether those with power could manipulate the system to their advantage. The fight was far from over, but the unseen weapon, the overlooked land usage map, had given me the upper hand. Expression shifted from one of arrogance to visible shock. The legal maps, the zoning codes, everything she had relied on to manipulate the situation was being dismantled in front of her. The narrative she had crafted, positioning herself as the victim of my obstruction, was now unraveling. She stood up abruptly, her voice rising in pitch and intensity. "How dare you?" she shouted, her hands trembling with rage. "This is not how things are supposed to go. I've paid good money for this view, and I won't let you." I stood up as well, maintaining eye contact with her. There was no reason to be intimidated now. The evidence was clear, and the law was on my side. Let me what? Destroy my life? Force me off my own land? Her response was immediate and louder, bordering on hysteria. "This is my neighborhood. I won't let you ruin it." Her eyes were wild as she moved closer, her voice cracking with frustration. "I've already spoken to the developers. They'll buy you out. They'll bulldoze your hut, and you'll be gone. You're nothing but a nuisance." The room quieted at her outburst, and all eyes turned to me. The judge slammed his gavel against the desk with an abrupt force, trying to restore some order to the chaos. "Enough," he commanded, his voice stern. "Sit down, Mrs. Karen. This is not the time for theatrics." But Karen wasn't done. She was desperate now, her posture rigid with defiance, her words quick and sharp. "You don't understand. I've worked hard for this. I'm not letting some man's poor decision ruin what I've built." She paused, attempting to regain some composure. "You'll regret this. I've already made arrangements. You'll be out of here soon enough." I shook my head, my tone steady. "No, Karen, you've already lost. The truth is out. Your plans, your manipulation, it's all crumbling. And it's you who's the nuisance." The room fell silent again. Karen's face was flushed with anger, but there was something else. There now fear. The truth, the facts, and the law had caught up to her, and she couldn't spin them into the narrative she had hoped for. She glanced at her lawyer, who was now visibly uncomfortable, having no response to the revelation about the rezoning issues. Karen's plan, which had seemed airtight only hours earlier, was now in shambles. The judge, looking at both parties with a mix of irritation and concern, cleared his throat. "I believe we've reached the point where further outbursts will not be tolerated. If you wish to continue this discussion, it will be done respectfully and within the bounds of the law. Mrs. Karen, you will take a seat or I will have you removed." Karen, clearly frustrated, finally lowered herself back into her chair, her body rigid with indignation. The words she had spoken, while filled with venom, revealed the cracks in her carefully constructed image of control. She was no longer in charge of the situation, and she knew it. The judge's attention shifted to Sarah and me. "Now that the outburst had subsided, I trust the counsel for the defense is ready to proceed," he asked, though there was no real question in his tone. The momentum had shifted, and the judge understood that the balance had tipped in our favor. Sarah wasted no time. "Yes, Your Honor, we have presented the facts, and the evidence speaks for itself. Karen's case is based on personal grievance and manipulation. The legal issues surrounding her property, including the failure to properly rezone for development, are clear. It's time to move past the theatrics and focus on what's truly at stake here." The judge nodded, acknowledging the shift in the proceedings. He turned to Karen, who was now sitting silently, her arms crossed tightly in front of her chest. The sense of authority that had once emanated from her was gone, replaced by the realization that the case had been irrevocably altered. Karen's lawyer, realizing there was no more room for maneuvering, spoke up reluctantly. "Your Honor, we request an adjournment to review the newly presented evidence and prepare our response." The judge considered this for a moment. "I will grant a short recess. This case is far from over, but the facts will need to be examined thoroughly." As the recess was called, I allowed myself a moment to breathe. The battle was far from finished, but for the first time, I could see the outcome in clearer terms. Karen's facade of control had cracked, and the truth was now out in the open. The rest of the fight would now be about securing the legal victory. That would safeguard my home and, by extension, my right to exist peacefully on the land I had always called home. The confrontation had revealed something critical. Karen's plan wasn't just about removing an obstruction to her view. It was about controlling the land, bending the legal system to her will, and eliminating any challenge to her vision. But with the law now on my side, it was clear that her vision would not prevail. The system may have been stacked against me, but the truth had proven to be a powerful force in this courtroom. The judge remained still for a moment, eyes fixed on the map Sarah had submitted. Then he turned to the legal documents outlining the discrepancies in Karen's zoning actions. His earlier confidence appeared to waver as he reviewed the details again. The map had clearly caught his attention, and the documents Sarah presented were irrefutable. It was a rare moment when the weight of the law seemed to momentarily shift. After what felt like an eternity, the judge finally spoke. I'm going to call a recess, he said, his voice lacking the authority it had once had. The words were spoken quietly, as though the decision itself had taken him by surprise. The gavel followed shortly after, striking once before. He stood, signaling the abrupt halt to the hearing. The room, once filled with loud exchanges, now stood in silence. Karen, once so poised, now seemed uneasy as she glanced at her lawyer. The tables had turned. For the first time, Karen's arguments, which had been presented with such force, were being questioned. The map and the zoning issue had cast doubt on her entire approach. She had built her case on the assumption that she could remove my home without scrutiny. But the evidence was now impossible to ignore. As the judge called for the recess, I couldn't help but recognize the shift in momentum. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, it was no longer a foregone conclusion. Karen had lost the upper hand. This small but critical moment indicated that the system, which had initially seemed stacked in her favor, had started to reveal its flaws. For all her power and influence, Karen's actions had been exposed, and there was no turning back. I knew this wasn't the final resolution, but it was a pivotal point. In the courtroom, the legal structure that had seemed impenetrable for so long had shown a crack. The gavel wasn't just a signal of a brief pause, it was a sign that the system's hold was loosening. The ground beneath Karen's case was shifting, and the earlier certainty that had favored her was no longer so secure. As the recess was announced, Karen's lawyer began a quiet conversation with her, no doubt attempting to reassess their position. Sarah, too, seemed focused, reviewing the documents one more time. But the reality was clear. The weight of the law was no longer solely on Karen's side. The case wasn't closed, but the way forward had changed. When the judge finally returned after the recess, there was a new air about the room. The legal back and forth had become more deliberate. Karen's team, once aggressive and confident, now seemed more cautious. They had been put on the defensive, and it was apparent that their strategy would need adjustment. The judge, although still in control, now seemed less certain about how he would rule. The time for assumptions and quick judgments had passed. The recess had created a brief but telling break in the proceedings. It wasn't just a pause in the hearing, it was a pause in the prevailing narrative. The system's grip on my case had been shaken, and while the outcome was still uncertain, the idea that I might be forced to leave my land, to give in to Karen's demand, now seemed less inevitable. It was clear that Karen was now facing an uphill battle. What had started as a straightforward case of obstruction had turned into a complex issue of land use and legal compliance. The documents Sarah had provided, highlighting Karen's failure to properly rezone her property, had opened a new door. The strategy that had been built on her wealth and influence now had a significant challenge in the form of the law. As the judge called for further deliberation, Karen's earlier confidence was gone. The system had responded, and the system's response was far less predictable than she had anticipated. When the final ruling was issued, it marked the collapse of Karen's plan. Her developer partners, who had been quietly supporting her efforts to transform the neighborhood, pulled out one by one. The zoning issues she had overlooked were revisited and corrected, shifting the focus away from her attempts to rezone land for commercial purposes. My land, which had been legally designated for residential use from the beginning, was protected. My home, the Adobe hut that had been at the center of the conflict, remained standing. The ruling didn't just confirm the legality of my home, it also shattered Karen's influence in the area. Her connections, her attempts to control the development, and her narrative that had been so easily accepted earlier in the process all fell apart under the scrutiny of the law. Her efforts to turn the community into a high-end resort destination, to erase the diversity of its inhabitants, were halted. Despite the ruling, Karen attempted to rally. She tried to appeal the decision, holding on to the hope that her wealth and connections could overturn the outcome. But by then, the fight had already drained her. Her plans had been exposed for what they were, an attempt to control the land. For her own benefit, each new legal attempt she made was met with resistance, and slowly, even her closest allies distanced themselves. Her initial confidence had eroded as the legal challenges mounted, and her vision of turning the area into an exclusive enclave crumbled. Karen eventually accepted the reality that she could no longer push her plans forward. The appeal failed, and her attempts to undermine my rights became unsustainable. The developers who had once been on her side withdrew entirely. The broader community, having witnessed the legal challenges, began to recognize the manipulation that had been taking place. With Karen's influence broken, she left, her plans for a luxury resort fading into the background. The neighborhood, once under her sway, began to rebuild itself in a way that reflected its true diversity. The land was no longer a site for commercial exploitation, but a place where different types of people could live and coexist. The outcome, though hard-fought, was a reaffirmation of the value of standing up when the system seemed to have already decided against you. In the end, the legal battle wasn't just about property or zoning, it was about the principle of fairness. It was about fighting for what was right when it seemed as though the odds were stacked against you. The victory was not just mine, but for everyone who stood against an unjust system, even when it appeared to be impossible. My Adobe hut remained, not just as a home, but as a symbol of the resilience needed to stand firm in the face of adversity. And despite everything that had happened, I remained in my home, where it had always been meant to be. The community had returned to its roots, and the space I had fought for was now secure. Karen's empire had crumbled, and my place within the land, within the community, was no longer in question. In the end, I had won, not just the legal case, but the broader struggle for fairness and justice.